Victoria Hale and Richard Morgan seemed like the perfect couple. She was the stunning young wife everyone admired, and he was the wealthy businessman who had everything. But behind the glamorous photos and lavish lifestyle, secrets were waiting to be uncovered. When Victoria discovered that Richard's fortune was crumbling, her dream life twisted into a nightmare. What followed was a shocking tale of greed, betrayal, and poison that turned love into tragedy. Victoria Hale entered Richard Morgan's world like a storm cloaked in beauty and charm. She was younger, radiant, and carried herself with the elegance of someone who seemed born for wealth. Richard, a man in his 60s, was admired by many for his success in real estate, investments, and philanthropy. He was the kind of man who turned heads at any event, not only because of his commanding presence, but because of the power and money attached to his name. When the two married, whispers followed them everywhere. Some said she was only in it for the money, while others believed it was a rare story of love that defied age and convention. To the public eye, they became the couple everyone envied. The wedding itself was lavish, the type written about in glossy magazines. Expensive flowers, sparkling chandeliers, and a guest list filled with celebrities and influential business leaders set the tone for their life together. Victoria smiled in every photo, her arm hooked around Richard's. Her eyes lit up with the kind of happiness that looked unshakable. For her it seemed like the perfect escape from an ordinary life into a world of luxury. For him, it was a renewal of youth, a second chance at romance, and the warmth of companionship in his later years. Behind the carefully crafted image, however, shadows began to creep in. Victoria's life quickly transformed into one of endless travel, fine dining, and jewels that sparkled as bright as her smile. But with luxury came expectations. Richard was not just a man in love, he was also a man protecting an empire. He reminded her subtly of the responsibility she now shared as his wife. There were dinner parties to host, business associates to impress, and a constant need to maintain their reputation as untouchable. Victoria adjusted quickly, but beneath her graceful exterior, she harbored a growing restlessness. Richard's wealth, which had dazzled her from the beginning, became the foundation of her world. Every designer gown she wore, every vacation home she visited, reinforced the belief that she had secured her future. Yet in quiet moments when the crowds were gone, Victoria often stared at herself in the mirror, wondering how much of her marriage was love and how much was ambition. Those thoughts never lingered long, because Richard's affection was genuine and his gifts seemed limitless. It was easy to silence doubts when diamonds sparkled on her fingers and champagne filled her glass. But whispers about Richard's finances began to circulate. A lawsuit here, a failed investment there, small cracks in an empire that once seemed unbreakable. Victoria brushed them aside, convinced that Richard's brilliance would outshine temporary setbacks. She had come too far to let rumors unsettle her. Still, the seed of uncertainty had been planted. She had tied her future to a man who looked untouchable. But what if the image was just that image? As the first year of their marriage passed, Victoria stood at the center of her glamorous world, adored and admired. Yet in the silence of her thoughts, she began to realize that the glittering dream she had stepped into might not last forever. And for someone like Victoria, the idea of losing everything was unthinkable. Victoria's suspicions about Richard's fortune began quietly, almost like whispers carried through the wind. At first, she dismissed them as jealous gossip from outsiders who envied her marriage. But as the months went by, the signs grew harder to ignore. The extravagant dinner parties Richard once threw with ease became less frequent. Certain business trips were canceled without explanation, and a few close associates seemed to drift away, their once constant presence at the estate replaced with silence. One afternoon, Victoria stumbled across a letter tucked into a folder in Richard's study. It mentioned unpaid debts, court hearings, and investments that had collapsed without recovery. She held the paper in her trembling hands, her eyes scanning the lines over and over until the words blurred. For a moment, her breath caught in her throat. The man she thought was untouchable was entangled in financial ruin, and no one outside the household seemed to know. She confronted him indirectly, masking her fear with carefully chosen questions, but Richard remained calm and confident. He told her that business had its ups and downs and that nothing could truly harm his empire. His tone was firm, almost rehearsed, and though Victoria forced a smile and nodded, inside her mind raced with panic. If the empire fell, so too would the life she had built for herself, the glamorous clothes, the recognition, the admiration. She was no longer just a woman in love. She was a wife whose identity was stitched into the fabric of wealth. Without it, she would unravel. Victoria began to study him more closely, noticing how often he disappeared into private meetings, how his face occasionally hardened with worry when he thought no one was looking. The nights he once spent sharing stories of business triumphs turned into long hours behind closed doors. Working late into the night, he grew quieter, more reserved, though he tried to keep up the image of confidence whenever she was near. But Victoria could feel the shift, and her instincts told her that the life she clung to was slipping away. Her mind started to wander into dangerous places. She thought about what her future would look like if Richard lost everything. She imagined herself stripped of the glittering jewels, walking through the same streets she had left behind before marrying him. The thought filled her with dread. It wasn't just about money. It was about power, respect, and the thrill of being desired by all who saw her. To lose it would mean fading back into obscurity, and that was something she could not allow. As weeks turned into months, Victoria's restlessness grew. She began reading about cases where wealthy men left their fortunes behind after sudden deaths, how widows inherited vast estates and lived freely afterward. It was morbid curiosity at first, but it soon became a pattern, a quiet obsession she nurtured in the solitude of her thoughts. Victoria understood one thing with chilling clarity. Her marriage was not just about love, anymore it was about survival. If Richard's empire truly crumbled, her world would collapse with it. And if she couldn't save the wealth that bound them together, she might have to find another way to secure her future. Victoria's thoughts turned darker with each passing day. What began as fear of losing her lavish life soon evolved into a dangerous fixation on how she could preserve it at any cost. She replayed the possibilities in her mind, measuring every scenario against the same outcome. Her future was only secure if Richard's wealth remained in her hands. The whispers of scandal and debt had shaken her, but the prospect of becoming his widow, inheriting what remained of his estate, glimmered like a solution she could not ignore. Her research deepened in secret, while Richard believed she was indulging in idle hours of magazines and novels. Victoria was studying crime stories, old news articles, and methods that had evaded suspicion. She read of poisons that blended easily with wine, of substances that left little trace in the body, and of cases where deaths were mistaken for illness until it was too late. The thought disturbed her at first, her stomach nodding whenever she lingered too long on the details. But soon, the unease gave way to fascination, and then to something colder acceptance. Richard's health provided the perfect cover. Though strong and imposing, he was not immune to the weariness of age. He often complained of indigestion after heavy meals, and his occasional fatigue could easily be mistaken for signs of illness. Victoria began to take note of these moments, mentally cataloging how they might later disguise the true cause of his decline. The image of a grieving widow came easily to her mind, and she imagined how the world would comfort her, never suspecting the truth. She did not act rashly. Instead, she tested the waters with small gestures. She prepared drinks for him more often, offering to handle his evening tea or the glass of wine he enjoyed with dinner. She watched carefully, her eyes studying how easily he trusted her, how quickly he swallowed without a second thought. His faith in her was absolute, and that blind devotion fed her growing resolve. The very trust that had drawn him to her would become the instrument of his downfall. Her opportunity came during a quiet weekend at their countryside estate. Away from the prying eyes of associates and staff, Richard was relaxed, eager to spend time in what he described as their sanctuary. The estate sprawled across acres of manicured lawns and gardens, with a private lake shimmering under the sun. To outsiders, it was a paradise. To Victoria, it became the stage where her plan could unfold without interruption. She had already secured what she needed, a small vial, obtained through discreet channels, hidden carefully among her personal belongings. The substance inside was nearly invisible when mixed, its effects delayed but devastating. She practiced in her mind the exact moment she would pour it, the calmness she would wear on her face, the way she would feign worry as his health began to falter. But even as she prepared, fragments of hesitation clung to her. There were moments late at night when she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her heart pounding with the enormity of what she was planning. She thought about the vows they had exchanged, the moments of tenderness they had shared, fleeting glimpses of what might have been real love beneath all the wealth and appearances. Yet the fear of losing her place in the world was stronger than any flicker of conscience. Her life had become too entwined with power and prestige to let it slip away. By the end of the weekend, her mind was set. The fantasies she had played over and over in her head were no longer distant ideas, but steps toward a reality she would create. Victoria believed she had mastered her role. The devoted wife, the grieving widow, the woman who would inherit everything. She convinced herself that no one would ever suspect her, because who could imagine beauty hiding such cruelty? The stage was set, and the plan was no longer a thought, but an inevitability. All that remained was the moment she would turn fear into action. The countryside estate, with its rolling lawns and serene lake, became the backdrop for a quiet but deadly transformation in Victoria's marriage. To Richard, the trip was a retreat, a chance to escape the noise of the city and enjoy simple pleasures with his wife. He spoke of long walks, shared meals, and evenings by the fireplace. Victoria smiled and nodded, her face a mask of serenity, while beneath the calm surface her mind was focused on a single purpose. Every detail of the weekend was rehearsed in her thoughts, every movement calculated with precision. On the second evening, the opportunity presented itself. Richard asked her to pour him a glass of red wine, a ritual he often enjoyed after dinner. Victoria carried the bottle to the kitchen, her fingers steady despite the storm raging inside her chest. She retrieved the small vial she had hidden away, its contents shimmering faintly in the dim light. With a measured hand, she tipped it into the glass, watching as the liquid dissolved seamlessly, leaving no trace of its presence. For a moment she stared at it, as though the glass itself held the weight of her future. When she returned to the sitting room, Richard was waiting by the fire, the glow illuminating his features. She handed him the glass with a gentle smile, her expression betraying nothing of the intent behind it. He raised it in a small gesture of thanks before taking the first sip, completely unaware of the betrayal in his hands. Victoria sat across from him, feigning ease, her eyes carefully observing every swallow. Inside, her heart raced, each beat echoing like a drum against her ribs, but outwardly she remained composed, the picture of elegance and devotion. Hours passed before the first signs appeared. Richard complained of a dull ache in his stomach, dismissing it at first as indigestion. Victoria leaned forward, her face painted with concern, offering him water, adjusting the cushions, urging him to rest. He accepted her care with gratitude, never questioning the source of his discomfort. By midnight, the ache had grown sharper, forcing him to lie down. He looked pale, his breaths uneven, and beads of sweat formed on his forehead. Victoria played her role flawlessly. She hovered at his side, dabbing his brow with a cloth, whispering reassurances, and pretending to panic at his worsening state. She even suggested calling a doctor, though she knew the remote location and late hour would delay any help from arriving in time. Each passing moment brought Richard closer to collapse, and with every labored breath, Victoria's future seemed more secure. By dawn, Richard's strength had all but vanished. His once powerful frame lay weak and trembling, his voice barely audible as he tried to speak. Victoria held his hand, her expression one of heartbreak, but inside she felt the cold triumph of inevitability. He slipped further into unconsciousness, and she kept vigil, her eyes dry even as she pressed a handkerchief to her face in a practiced show of grief. When Richard finally succumbed, the estate was cloaked in silence. Victoria allowed herself a single, steady breath before setting the stage for what would follow. She called for help hours later, her voice breaking with carefully crafted sobs, telling anyone who would listen that her beloved husband had died suddenly in his sleep. The news spread quickly, and sympathy poured in from all directions. Friends, colleagues, and acquaintances mourned the loss of a man they respected, and their condolences to Victoria were filled with admiration for her strength in the face of tragedy. Few questioned the story, for Richard's age and declining health made the narrative believable. But beneath the surface, not everything aligned so neatly. Some who had seen him days before remarked on how robust he still seemed, how unlikely it was for such a sudden decline to occur without warning, and though Victoria wore black, accepted condolences, and played her role as grieving widow with grace. Faint whispers of suspicion had begun to circulate. The days following Richard's death were filled with mourners, condolences, and public sympathy for Victoria. She wore her grief like a finely tailored gown, her eyes cast downward, her voice trembling just enough to seem authentic. The community saw her as a woman broken by sudden tragedy, and she accepted their pity with grace. For a while it seemed as though her plan had succeeded. She was the sole heir to Richard's estate, the mistress of his empire, and the woman everyone praised for her strength in the face of loss. But behind the curtain of sorrow, the foundation of her carefully constructed story began to crack. It was Richard's doctor who raised the first quiet doubts. Richard had been in good health for a man his age. He had shown no signs of heart trouble or chronic illness that might explain his rapid decline. The doctor voiced his concern to authorities, insisting that something about the circumstances didn't add up. Though reluctant to intrude on a grieving widow, the authorities agreed to investigate further. An autopsy was ordered. Much to Victoria's dismay, she argued against it, insisting that her husband's wishes had been for peace and dignity. But her protests only deepened suspicion. The autopsy revealed traces of a foreign substance in Richard's system, something that did not occur naturally. While the exact poison was difficult to identify, the presence of toxins was undeniable. Investigators quietly opened a case, treading carefully around Victoria while they gathered information. They interviewed staff, colleagues, and friends, piecing together the final days of Richard's life. Several recalled his sudden stomach pains during the retreat and noted that Victoria had been the one preparing his drinks. Victoria remained outwardly calm, though inside she felt her composure unraveling. She tried to deflect suspicion with charm and sorrow, insisting that she had cared for Richard with all her heart, but her insistence only fueled curiosity. Investigators began to scrutinize her history, uncovering the ambitious patterns she had hidden beneath her polished image. Her rapid transformation from an ordinary woman to the wife of a wealthy businessman now seemed less like romance and more like strategy. The turning point came when forensic specialists examined the wine bottle taken from the estate. Tiny residues clung to the inside of the glass, revealing the presence of the same toxin found in Richard's body. The discovery was damning. Victoria's perfect crime, which she had believed left no trace, had betrayed her in the smallest of details. Her arrest shocked the community. The grieving widow, once admired for her elegance and resilience, was now accused of orchestrating her husband's death for his fortune. The media swarmed the story, painting her as a femme fatale whose beauty masked a ruthless heart. In court, the prosecution portrayed her as calculating and manipulative, a woman who studied her husband's weaknesses and exploited his trust to secure her future. Victoria maintained her innocence, insisting she had been framed, that she had loved Richard deeply, but the evidence spoke louder than her pleas. The poisoned wine, the inheritance she stood to gain, and her unusual resistance to an autopsy painted a picture too compelling to ignore. Witness after witness described her ambition, her fascination with wealth, and her cold composure during Richard's final hours. When the verdict was delivered, the courtroom held its breath. Guilty. The word echoed through the chambers, sealing her fate. Victoria's dream of eternal wealth and admiration had dissolved into a nightmare of prison walls and whispered condemnation. She had traded love for greed, and in the end, lost everything. The story of Victoria and Richard became more than just another crime tale. It was a haunting reminder of how quickly desire can transform into destruction, and how beneath the surface of beauty and glamour, darkness can hide in plain sight.